Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here, back with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. And having taken quite the break from this series, what better way to resurrect it from the dead than with the good old vampire counts. And so that is the faction we are going to be covering today. Now, this is a faction that's seen quite a few ups and downs over the years, gone from being probably OP to at one point, for example, being an borderline auto win for the Tomb Kings in their matchups. They've just been all over the place. Now, after some severe nerfs to some of their most significant spells, most notably Invocation of the Heck, as well as Raise Dead, and some nerfs to some of their prime units, the faction has really slid down to being more of a mid-tier faction. They definitely have some serious struggle street matchups. They are still very powerful in a handful of matchups as well, but definitely not the top-tier alpha that they used to be. So it's going to be interesting to discuss them. One of the very first things we're going to be touching on, and one of the things that really makes this roster kind of stand out, is their variety of lords. And it's not simply having a dozen flavors of the same exact mage. They actually have rather different lords in performance, and so this is going to be an interesting tiering to discuss, because while some of these lords are certainly redundant, many of them are unique and can provide new playstyles or different playstyles. So without further ado, let's dive in, and we are going to start with the true von Carstein, Vladdy Daddy, and I'm actually going to put him at B tier. So some of you may disagree. I know he's not the most common pick nowadays. However, I'm going to put him at B tier because I really like Vlad. And I use Vlad actually quite a lot in many of my builds. And that's because Vlad's, despite all the changes to many of the other characters, despite the fact that foot characters are not necessarily the best, and there's some very powerful lore choices, Vlad remains a tank. He's an absolute beast to kill. And despite the fact that there are some newer units that are really stupidly good at sniping lords, and of course Empire's always had the Luminarch, but now we also see units such as Marcus Wolfheart. Of course the Skaven have gotten their Giselles, factions like that. We see some of these nasty options. Despite that, Vlad remains tanky, and one of the keys to his success here is the Carstein ring. If you need to close the gap, for many foot characters, it is suicidal to try to close the gap against artillery, against accurate range shooting, against magic missiles, that sort of thing. But Vlad, if he is being focused by, say, a Luminarch, if he is being focused by Witches or whatever it might be, he can actually tank through that, at least until he can reach the enemy lines, because of the Carstein ring. It gives him 30 seconds of 90% damage resistance, and that is insane. Besides that, Vlad does have decent magic generation because he has Arcane Conduit. Full lore vampires, as to be expected. Very solid regen. If you don't hit your healing cap with Vlad in a game, you've probably done something wrong. He's relatively cheap, decent fighter. He does have Master of Beguilement, potentially dropping enemy melee attack by 44. And this is castable as many times as you can get the cooldown off. The cooldown is relatively short. Off the top of my head, I believe it's 90 seconds. He also does have -4 leadership with Aura of Dark Grandeur. So stacked on top of Fear and Terror, this is a very potent combination for a faction that is really good at breaking lines with Fear and Terror. He's just a solid all-around lord. I do give him B tier. Of course, the foot characteristics are limiting. He's not super flexible. He can't necessarily be in the fights you need him to be in, unless you have a build specifically designed to make him work, or bring a Necromancer to support him. So he's not necessarily the best, but I do think he's a viable option and a unique and competitive option. Now, next up, we do have the loser who ruined the old world, and that is Manfred von Carstein. Baldo McLoserface who shanked Gelt and ruined everything. So, he's an S tier, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately, I don't know. He's a really good lord. Full access to Lore of Death and Vampires makes him... actually means that he's still the only lord in the game to have access to multiple full lores. Now, this is likely to remain the case, I suspect, for the rest of the Warhammer life cycle, but... it is his unique gimmick. Having full access to Lore of Death is actually pretty nifty. Now, there are other characters in the Vampire roster that have access to Lore of Death. Perhaps most significant are the Strigoi Ghoul Kings and the Strigoi Bloodline Lord, as well as the Necrarch Lord. So those guys all have access to some Lore of Death spells, but Manfred has access to full Lore of Death. He's got amazing Winds of Magic generation between Master of the Black Arts, as well as the passive for Lore of Death, as well as the fact that he's got the Sword of Unholy Power, which lets him generate insane amounts of Winds of Magic. He's got amazing mount options. You can bring him on foot if you want, in fact. You can bring him on a horse, you can bring him on a Hellsteed, and of course a dragon, which is incredibly potent. There's really nothing bad to be said there. If he has a weakness, it's his lack of abilities, really. Everything about Manfred's entire existence is centered around spamming spells. And that's not a bad thing. He is definitely potent, but he does not have abilities that are free of Winds of Magic. He doesn't have abilities to make him a better killer or a defensive support lord or anything along those lines. He is a Winds of Magic spammer with decent combat stats. So, actually pretty good combat stats, to be honest, but by Vampire Count standards, it's just decent, I would say. But definitely that is more than enough to bump him up into S tier. There basically isn't a build where he's bad. Now, going through the legendary Vampire Lords, and we will get to the non-vampiric ones in just a jiffy, we do have Vlad von Carstein's consort, and that is Isabella. And I'm going to give her a D tier. And I know some of you may disagree. I know some of you enjoy Isabella, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think she is a competitive or viable choice. But I think that in comparison to nearly all of the other, not all of them, but nearly all of the other Vampire Count Lords, she is a weak choice. This is because basically her entire kit is centered around the idea of supporting heroes and herself with heals. She has the Blood Chalice of Batory, which is a very potent heal as well as a vigor boosting ability. It's not weak, but the problem is you don't really have the characters to support with it. Vampire Count heroes as well as Necromancers have a passive heal. Now, White Kings and Banshees can use the heal, however, they have a very low HP pool, so it's generally not difficult to keep them topped up, HP-wise. Granted, you would have to use an Invocation of the Heck for it, but still, do you really want to bring a character solely to make a hero mob work? And Isabella herself does not have a huge HP pool. She does have good melee defense. She's not a pushover who just rolls over and dies, especially because she can be put on a Hellsteed and run away if she needs to. But ultimately, she's not really that tanky. Her HP pool is not as insane as Vlad's, who's got over 4,000. She doesn't have great Winds of Magic generation. She's not necessarily the greatest of fighters. Like, she's about a Vlad tier. Granted, she's on a Hellsteed, so you can move around more, but not the most amazing mount options either, because you only have one mount option. Essentially, her only gimmick is hero support. And because she doesn't get a dragon mount, and the heroes she supports have relatively low HP themselves, the benefits of that are very questionable in my opinion, and in most cases you just don't care to bring her. Which is not to say she's useless. She can still support Banshees. She can still support Vampire Heroes or White Kings, especially. But I think she's one of the weaker lords for sure. Which does bring on to the legendary Lord Red Duke, or the pseudo-legendary Lord, perhaps Red Duke. And he, in my mind, is hovering somewhere between a B and a C tier. I'm going to give him a C. I think the big problem for this guy is simply that despite the nerfs to the Helm of Discord, despite the changes made to the Blood Dragon Vampire Lord, the Red Duke is still weaker. He is still the weaker option. His one big gimmick is Elseef. He does also get Potion of Strength, but he doesn't get the insane in-combat buffs of the Blood Dragon. He doesn't get an Armor Sundering Contact effect to support Blood Knight super well, so he doesn't necessarily synergize with units outside of like a sniping goon squad with Vargulfs or Terrorgeists very well. And Helm Discord is just way more utility ultimately than Elseef is. Elseef is strong if you need to snipe a Lord or Hero, but oftentimes you need to fight other units, and Elseef can't debuff those units. It doesn't affect anything besides Lords and Heroes. So I think for utility, this guy's just C tier. And then yes, he's viable. He is nice as a Lord sniping option still, but when push comes to shove, he's definitely a weaker option than the Blood Dragon, and probably a weaker option than most of the Vampire Lords that we will be discussing as we go through this list. Now, next up, we do have Elgorst, the meme lord. Hellman Gore is just, well, he's a meme. He's an F tier for me. Now, I do know that he has been used successfully in some tabletop tournaments. I believe it was Soothsayer who used him successfully in a tabletop tourney. But Gorst is just bad. If you're looking for a competitive lord choice, you are not going to take Gorst in like any situation really. His one big gimmick is his Mortis Engine effect, which means you don't have to bring a Mortis Engine to get that effect. You get it on your Lord. That would be great, except he's super slow, so he's a super easy snipe target, whether in melee, whether by magic missiles, whether by normal missiles, whether by monsters, whatever. Anything gets on top of Gorst, he's screwed. He can't escape. He can't really fight back that well. He's a pushover, and it sucks. His Winds of Magic is okay. The problem is you have to bring a caster alongside him. He's not even a super budget choice. You have to bring a caster because his Raised Dead is replaced with a Raised Graveguard or White King if you overcast it. And that ability kind of sucks because before, Graveguard Summon wasn't bad. Actually, I actually enjoyed that ability quite a bit because getting your Graveguard like that, Graveguard's a strong unit. So having a Graveguard unit that would stick around for a while meant that it would do a lot of damage. Now, however, due to the new summon mechanics, it is guaranteed to crumble and disintegrate relatively quickly, and you just do not get the value you would like from a 750 gold unit. And so ultimately, Hellman Gore just is not recommendable. He's just weak. Now, Kemmler is another B tier in my opinion. Krell Summon makes him super strong in a sense. He can get that easy terror route or a little bit of extra damage. He's got the Cloak of Mist and Shadows to make him a little tankier. He does have a horse mount now, so he's less easy to snipe than he used to be. He also does have the Chaos Tomb Blade, which means that if he is in melee, and he's not a terrible melee combatant, he's like Wurtsager for Enchantress tier. If he's in melee, he's granting everything around him, heals as well as melee attack buffs. So this is really nice because he can essentially play like a classic Necromancer where he sits behind the front line just sitting around providing his aura, his Master of Undeath and heals, or he can get into the thick of things and provide the Chaos Tomb Blade buff and provide heals that way. So no matter how you use him, good old Kemmler can provide good support, and for that he makes a B tier here. Obviously, I don't think he's sort of a top dog, but I think he brings enough versatility and enough unique characteristics to the field to make him worthwhile, especially over like the Red Duke or Isabella. Even though these guys might be better in like raw stats, when you compare them to the vampire counts, actual vampire characters that these guys really compete with for a slot, Kemmler doesn't necessarily compete with them for the same function. So the characters these guys compete with are just not as good as, whereas Kemmler has his own niche, essentially. Now, with those out of the way, we are going to move on to the non-legendary lords. And, you know what, we'll start with the sole non-vampire here, and that is the Master Necromancer. And this guy is, in my opinion, also a B tier. He's a dirt cheap. He provides the Aura of Undeath, or the Master of Undead. He does provide Invocation of Nehek, zombie summons. You can put him on a Hell Steed so he can be quick, nippy, and provide good summon support. All in all, he's a dirt cheap caster, and that's all you can expect. And it's a viable option. I'm not a huge fan of the Master Necromancer. I don't use him a lot, but I know some players are actually pretty fond of him, make great use of him, and I think it would be sort of unfair or remiss to put him at a lower tier because once again he delivers a bit of a unique function that someone like Kemmler, for example, or much less the vampire count heroes lords don't provide. He's just a cheap lord, and getting extra width can sometimes be valuable. Oftentimes vampire count armies, of course, do hinge on their hero or lord characters, but if you don't want to play that way, if you're playing against a faction where that's unnecessary, like honestly, for example, Empire, that's not necessary. You don't necessarily need to hinge on your lord against a faction like Empire or against a faction like, honestly, against Bretonnia, for example. Factions like that, Master Necromancer can be a big choice there and really help you out quite a bit while being cheap. Now, for the lords. Now we'll go through Bloodline lords first because actually we'll kind of go back and forth because some of the Bloodline lords have overlaps, and I think that will make them worth discussing in comparison to others. So first the Blood Dragon. I'm going to give him an A tier. I think he's very strong. Now he's not a good caster, and that is basically his only weakness. Besides that, he has amazing combat stats. You can put him on basically any mount you could care to put him on. Dragon, Hellsteed, Horse, foot, whatever. He's good no matter the form. He does provide an armor stirring effect. He does have which he can apply with an ability. Makes him stellar for supporting Blood Knights. He of course does have Helm of Discord, which is very strong. And he does have his ability that grants him ward save as well as leadership when in sustained melee, which is very, very strong. Basically, this guy's just a boss. He's an amazing fighter. Where Manfred is your alpha choice for casting spam, this guy is your top choice for combat. And so he's an easy A tier in my mind. Not quite S tier, because I do think there are other fighty vampire lords that have their own little niches and kind of upend him, where I don't think Manfred is really upended by anybody, not even the Necroarch, who's actually pretty strong in his own right, but I don't think he's quite up there. Now, next up, we do have the Lamina Vampire Lord. Now, I absolutely adore her. I think it is one of my favorite Lord's choices for the vampire counts, alongside probably Vlad. I absolutely love using the Lamina Vampire Lords. However, I think would be remiss of me to put her at a higher tier, because she's really not that strong. I like her. I like the things she brings to the table. I like her playstyle. I like some of the gimmicky tricks you can pull. She's got the Staff of Stability, which allows you to provide a unit with 44% magic resist. This is huge if you're using ethereal units. She also does have access to Enfeebling Foe, which is really nice if you need to nerf a unit's stats, make them easier to snipe out. She's got the usual full selection of mount options, some great AoE melee attack and speed debuffs, as well as some self buffs to keep herself alive just a little bit better. She's a very strong Lord choice, in my opinion. However, ultimately, Manfred, as well as the Blood Dragon, are just a bit more reliable, a bit more stable, and I think she's a decent choice. One of the things that I think does hold the vampire or the Lamina Lord back from being sort of, in my opinion, at least an A tier, is the fact that she doesn't have great Winds of Magic generation. If she was better at Winds of Magic generation, stacked on her solid versatility, I would probably bump her up to A tier immediately, because having both Lore of Shadows as well as Lore of Vampires mixed is a nice combo. It's the only Lord in the Vampire Count roster who does that. We have other Lords for other mixed Lords, but she's the only one with that. Now, the Necroarch, we do get a mix of a few different things. You get some beast traits, death traits, as well as Lore of Vampires traits with this guy, which is very, very nice. He is a high-end caster, relatively speaking. Not quite on par with Manfred, but he does have the passes from both Lore of Beast as well as Lore of Death, which allows him to get some really cool Winds of Magic generation. So he's very strong that way. He's got, once again, full mount selection. Dragon, Hellsteed, Horse. Not the greatest fighter. I think for me, he hovers somewhere between A and B tier. I'll probably put him at, I think B is probably where I'd put him, because he's just not that good of a fighter. He's not as good of a fighter as Manfred. So while he does have that stellar Winds of Magic generation, that decent selection of options, ultimately he usually competes with Manfred for a slot, and while you might bring him for a niche role compared to Manfred, he does have some better self-survivability than Manfred does. For example, he's got some self-buffs that can make him tankier for a little bit. I just don't think he's up to snuff with Manfred. Manfred's just generally better, because Sword of Unholy Power and Master of the Black Arts is just so strong. And the poor Necroarch can't quite compete with that. He's still a strong Lord choice, but B tier. And this is actually going to be a common trend here with these Vampire Count Lords. I'm going to be straight with you guys. Many of them are, in my opinion, sort of just a decent choice, but they're not a must-have or a choice that's always great. There's nuance, and you can sort of cherry-pick the Lord you want in a specific match, which is, in my opinion, great. Now, the Carstein Lord, also, in my opinion, a B tier. If you want to make aerial dominance plays, this guy is your best bud, because he has the Storm of Midnight, allows you to, basically it's a Tempest, does a good amount of damage to enemy flyers, especially critical nowadays when Vampire Count flyer builds got sort of hamstrung by the flyer limits. Vampire Counts by far were the worst hit faction by far when it came to flyer limits, because no other faction relied on cheap chaff to win them the aerial dominance than the Vampire Counts. And so this guy can still help you swing the tide a little bit better. He also does have a unique Vargulf summon, which is kind of cool, being able to get a Vargulf on the field, though I don't really think it has much use in practical games. It's still funny to see. Really, his main gimmick is that aerial power play, and for that, I think he's a B tier. Now the Strigoi line. So this is one where we're actually going to directly compare the Bloodline versus the non-Bloodline. Bloodline Lord is, in my opinion, a solid B. Non-Bloodline Lord is a solid D, and probably on borders on F. I would almost put this guy at an F tier. The reason being is that the Strigoi, these two are incredibly similar. If you compare it, so Manfred and the Necrarch definitely compete for a slot. The Blood Dragon and the Red Duke compete for a slot, but ultimately they do have certain benefits that the other Lord does not have. In the case of the Strigoi Ghoul King versus the Strigoi Bloodline Lord, there's very little functional difference. The two perform very similarly. The only real difference is that the King is cheaper, has worse stats, and has a buff that he can apply to other units, but it's a very tiny, sort of 20% damage buff. Whereas the Strigoi Ghoul King does have, the Bloodline Lord has better stats. He's got better self buffs to, like Claws of Morcane. He's got a crazy self heal. He's just got better combat stats in general. Both have access to the exact same Lore of Magic, which gets you Crypt Ghoul Summon, which gets you Spirit Leech, and all that sort of stuff. So they're just very similar lords, and essentially, and when push comes to shove, you're rather going to pay that extra little bit of money for the Bloodline Lord and get those better stats and that better performance than you will for the cheaper Ghoul King and the tiny benefits that he provides. I think these guys are so close together in performance. The only reason I put this Ghoul King here is because I think if you put them on a Terrorgeist, their performance gets a little closer stat-wise. And the Ghoul King is a bit cheaper, and he does have the benefit of that sort of buff that you can apply to other units, which is nifty. So I think there is a little bit of a slot there for him, but it's very tiny, very minuscule, and I think he borders on F tier. And it's not really because he's a terrible lord. He's not sort of a joke like Gorse, but he just doesn't compete. He does compete for the exact same role as the Strigoi Ghoul King, Vampire Bloodline Lord, and he's just worse. And finally, last but not least, or I guess least, because he's going to get an F tier, is the Vampire Lord. This guy isn't bad. He's got lore vampire just like every other vampire character. He's a decent fighter. He's got some self buffs. He's got some utility. But if you're going to bring a lord, you're going to bring anybody but him. He's not a happy medium between caster and fighter necessarily. Even though I feel like that's what CA was going for in designing this guy's kit, but he's not quite at that happy medium. So realistically, if you want a Vampire Lord, you're going to find a better alternative who's good enough or better than this guy. Thing is, this guy's not cheap. He costs the same or close to the same as basically every other Vampire Lord when stripped down. His combat stats are not really much, if any, better. His spell selection is standard. It's bog average. No crazy Winds of Magic generation. No crazy combat stat buffs. And ultimately, if I want a fighter, I'm going to bring a Blood Dragon, or I'm going to bring the Red Duke. If I want a caster, I'm going to bring the Necrarch or Manfred. They're close enough to this guy in whatever they're not specialized in, while simultaneously just being so much better in the other categories. So if you're looking for a fighter, so for example, Manfred's a good enough fighter while being an amazing caster. Well, this guy's just a mediocre both caster and fighter. The Blood Dragon might not be a great caster, but he's an amazing fighter. And I think the ultimate reality is that especially Manfred, Blood Dragon, Necrarch, Red Duke, and the Carstein Lord completely shove this guy aside. They compete with him for almost the exact same function, and he just doesn't stand a chance at all. And he really needs, in my opinion, a bit of ability rework to make him shine. Now for heroes, first and foremost, the Necromancer. In my opinion, an easy A. Actually, you know what? I'm going to give him an S tier because he's mandatory in almost any build that doesn't. He's honestly mandatory in a lot of builds, even builds where you have a great casting character, and even if you don't have a great caster character, he's an amazing choice. He's a dirt cheap lord. He's got his he's got the Rod of Corruption, which is amazing because this guy regens, so the self damage doesn't matter. But the fact that you get extra Winds of Magic is amazing for such a magic heavy faction. You can put him on a cheap horse, so you can run around, cast summons, cast Invocation of the Heck, just amazing buffs there. He's got Master of the Undead, which allows you to heal and support effectively. If he's sort of just camping beyond your line. His only real downside is that, well, he's got Corpse Cart mount options, but none of, like, you don't really want to bring this guy on a Corpse Cart most of the time, so I think that's kind of a meh option on him. But ultimately, it's just whining about options when really his base kit and on a horse, this guy's an amazing choice. And I think an easy A to S tier. You almost always bring a Necromancer, I feel, with almost every build for the Vampire counts. Next up, we do have the Banshee. Banshee's, in my opinion, somewhere between B and C tier. I'll put her at B. Fear, Terror, Wailing Banner gives you a -4 leadership debuff in an AoE, which is really nice. She is incredibly difficult to kill for the vast majority of units. Only heroes or lords with magic damage are really good at killing Banshees. Even magic units will generally struggle to kill a Banshee because she's a small target and difficult to get good hits on. She's not the most amazing fighter, but the way she can just harry and pressure an opponent is just brutal. I've seen her used against dwarfs, for example, with really a great efficiency despite their magic resist, because she's just so difficult for them to kill. So she can just harry and pressure your line for ages. And that is why she gets an easy B tier here. I don't think she's a stellar option that you'll take every time, but between her speed and survivability and passable combat stats and terror and leadership debuff, she's a nice hero in a lot of cases. White King. Now this guy, I will admit, I'm not the most experienced with, and personally I would probably rate him somewhere around C or D tier because I don't use him very often and I don't like him in my builds. Most of my builds as vampire accounts are either cav or monster heavy, and the White King's not necessarily great in either of those. He's more of most players I've seen use the White King use him on foot, or maybe they bring him on a horse, but they sort of use him as an independent agent where he just kind of goes where needed. And this isn't bad. The White King's actually strong. He's tough to kill. He can hit like a truck against infantry. He does have Scab's Wrath, which can do some decent damage if occasionally against squishier targets. He's not a bad character, just not really my cup of tea, which is why I'm going to give him a B tier. I think, once again, like the Banshee, it's a bit of a niche choice. Not necessarily amazing with cavalry builds, though he can be used as a backline disrupt. Or it can be used to help ground-bound foot goon squads. Yeah, I think B tier is just decent. He's a decent infantry anchor and support character, much like the Banshee, except he doesn't get terror. Instead, he gets a Scab's Wrath. And and if your opponent has magic damage, he's definitely a bit of a tankier option than the Banshee. Now, for the vampire hero, she gets a C tier, and I would say she borders on a D tier. Not necessarily a terrible character, but the characteristics on the vampire heroes are just lacking. Their two lores of magic are shadows and death. Now, back in the day, at least shadows was a lore you didn't have access to anyway but vampire heroes. Now, though, you can get a Lamina lord for that. And you get most of the better spells from Lore of Shadows through the Lamina lord. So you don't really need a Shadows caster. Death, well, you've got Manfred, who's immediately amazing. You've got the Necrarch. You do have the Strigoi, both of who bring Lore of Death. So that limits the magic options. Now, if you want a Goon Squad with these guys, these ladies are not bad, but they're very expensive because you are paying for that potential to be a caster, and if you don't want to use that, not that great. Their HP is very low, which is definitely a downside. So despite their self-healing potential, they can often die relatively easily. And I wouldn't say that. Don't get me wrong. I don't think it's not necessarily that it's a bad hero, but it's just a hero that whose utility is very limited. You don't get more Winds of Magic generation like with the Necromancer. You don't necessarily get terror like you would with the Banshee or cheap ethereal anchor. Sort of this cheap infantry support with like the White King. It's a relatively expensive hero, and if you're not bringing for the spells, sure, she's better at fighting than maybe a White King would be, but is it enough of a difference? Probably not. And I think it's a bit of a niche hero. You might bring her, once again, as a Goon Squad on a Hellsteed, definitely a solid pick. She's the only hero character you have that can get a Hellsteed, so that is a big boon for her. But and probably the one reason I'm putting her at a C tier is because if you're trying to Goon Squad, you're going to put her on a Hellsteed and have some great mobility. But ultimately, it's just a C for me. I also like the fact that you can get Wither on her alongside Doom and Darkness to get some insane leadership debuffs with Manfred. But that's another gimmick. Now for the infantry corps, well, if I could find them, I would put zombies up there, but I'm literally blind. There we go. Zombies are C tier. You might be surprised. Zombies are kind of a staple unit, but in my opinion, it's mostly the summon zombies you want. The non-summon zombies are kind of sketchy. The reason for that is that they're very slow. 23 speed is just unacceptable in many cases. It slows your entire army down. Even your Graveguard will be slowed down because these guys are 4 speed slower than Graveguard. That's terrible. It's very difficult to get these guys to engage and disrupt the enemy before your main line hits without having your main line take excessive amounts of damage. It's really uncomfortable trying to use these guys effectively, even though they are dirt cheap at 100 gold. They are great if you just need to flesh out your numbers, get more mass, get more quantity, sure. But usually the zombies you use are summons. And I think these guys are a C tier for that. Now, moving on to Skeleton and Swordsman, I think these guys are probably a D tier. You almost never see these guys. The standard chaff for vampire counts is really Skeleton Spears or zombies. Those are more of your throwaway go-tos. Otherwise, it's like you're going with Graveguard as a stable higher-end anchor. And so, unfortunately, yeah, just D tier for the Skellies. They're not atrocious. It's not like you'll never use them, but the situations where you want these guys over Skeleton Spears especially are very, very limited. And usually it's just if you run out of chaff slots in other categories that you turn to skeletons as your final last-ditch hope. Which does bring us on to Skelly Spears. These guys do get, in my opinion, at least an A tier, perhaps even a S tier, really. And it's not really because they're an amazing unit, but they are one of your only sources of anti-large, charge defense against large, some bonus versus large, some shields, not great armor or survivability per se, but they'll be your cheap anchor option. Where zombies and skeletons just roll over and die, really. These guys can hold a little bit longer. They can provide support against lighter cavalry or lighter flyers. Even against dragons or something, spears will jab them down. Most dragons have somewhere between 50 and 80 armor. So spears, if they hit, they're doing some damage to that. It's not absolutely hopeless. So for that, they get an A tier. They're just such a staple unit. So even if they aren't the greatest stat-wise, it's kind of like high elf spears. You almost always see them. You almost always use them. Just a very strong choice. Crypt Ghouls, in my opinion, a C tier. Definitely better than skeletons, utility-wise. Being a little bit faster, having poison, having decent weapon strength is a win for them. But they're terrible armor, terrible HP pool, and honestly, abysmal combat stats really drags these guys down into the muck. They don't trade super well into a lot of units that cost less than them, just because of how bad their stats are. And it's very difficult to protect these guys from missile play. And at 500 gold, these guys are reaching that tier where shooting them is worthwhile. If you have like cheap archers and you shoot Crypt Ghouls, hey, it's worth it. It's a win. Why not? So that's, in my opinion, a big downside for these guys. They're just so easy to shoot to death. And it's actually one of the... in my opinion, the Feasters in Dusk, who negate a lot of those disadvantages with Vanguard stock and a higher speed, are in a much better boat than the Crypt Ghouls, and we're going to see that in just a little bit. Now, next up, we do have what's probably my favorite unit in the Vampire Count infantry lineup, and that's Graveguard. These guys are another easy A tier, probably leaning towards S, same as the Spears. Amazing unit for the cost at cleaving through cheap trash. Silver shields, 90 armor. Even mid-tier infantry they'll hold up okay against. Like, I believe they trade relatively well into like Saurus with shields, which is pretty nuts. These guys are definitely no pushovers. The only real downside to them is that most of their combat performance is wrapped up, or their offensive combat performance is wrapped up in a bonus versus infantry. So if they're not fighting infantry, their performance tends to fall off very heavily. And that's really the main reason I wouldn't push them up to S tier. That and they're expensive-ish by Vampire standards at 750. So if you're not looking to do an infantry build, you're not going to bring these guys. You're probably going to go super cheap with spears and like zombies. So you're not always going to see these guys, but 1, 2, or 3 of them is often a good choice. And I think they're an easy A, at least. Now, Karen Wraiths, D tier in my opinion. Just not a good unit. Terrible HP. Their mobility is decent, but their leadership is abysmal. They are ethereal, but with that low HP, with that low leadership, they tend to crumble very easily. They often just can't get the damage on target because their offensive stats are just not that good. 28 melee attack isn't terrible. It's actually the best, I believe, out of all the Vampire Count units, infantry units. But they don't get a bonus versus infantry, so they're not exceedingly good against any target. There's only 45 of them. Just not a great unit. Very easily die to magic damage, and you can't escape that magic damage because you're not fast enough, really. 46 speed, Yes, you can outrun enemy infantry, but if your opponent pops like a Fist of Gork on a Savage Orc that's fighting your Carronades, they're probably dead before you can respond. And in my opinion, these guys are just D tier. If you're going to bring ethereal units, it's going to be Hex Wraiths, not these guys. So or Banshee. That's another thing. If you want a cheap ethereal, a Banshee is what you're going to bring, not these guys. Which does bring us on to the last generic infantry unit, which is Graveguard Great Weapons. These guys get a B tier in my opinion. A solid enough Great Weapon unit. 40 weapon strength, which is nuts, plus 10 bonus versus infantry, so they're up to 50. They're up to Black Orc weapon strength with a bonus versus infantry in play, which is very strong. But terrible melee stats. Both melee attack and defense are in the 20s, so against anything other than infantry, they're a kind of lackluster unit. No shields, of course, definitely a bit restricting there. And being a great weapon unit, they're definitely a bit more niche. There's specific matchups where you want to bring these guys, but you're not going to bring them in every single matchup. Many times the shielded variant is just much more useful and much more versatile, and good enough against most targets. While these guys are not going to beat elite infantry, they're just good enough against sort of mid and lower tier halberds, for example, stuff like that. But definitely not sort of the top creme de la creme unit for the Vampire Counts. I think both the Graveguard and the Spears are going to see more usage. These guys are a bit of a niche unit you choose if you want to have a specific build. Much like Crypt Ghouls, but I think Crypt Ghouls are a little bit less useful just because of how flimsy they are in comparison to the guys. Now, for the Regiments of Renown, the Tithe is, in my opinion, somewhere between D and F tier. I'm going to put them at D because I think if you want all the zombies, you will bring these guys. But right now they cost twice as much as a normal zombie. They're 200 gold versus 100 gold. And you only get 10% physical resist and 30 more models on the unit. Which is kind of meh. Like, 30 more... The extra... You don't get enough extra survivability, really. They obviously do get better stats because they are rank 9 zombies instead of rank 0 zombies. But paying double of that, having 2 zombies is just better than having 1 Tithe. And that's all there is to say about it, in my opinion. Back in the day when this unit was 250 and zombies were 150, I think these guys were a bit more justifiable. Because they were better than zombies. They could hold better. They were not double the price, and it was just 66% more cost. So I think they were more justifiable. But now at double the cost, I just don't see it. I think D, leaning towards even F tier, is where these guys belong. For the next one, we do have the Budget Graveguard, the Königstein Stalkers. One of my personal favorite units. When I say personal favorite, but it's a unit I actually enjoy using. They're your Budget Graveguard. 60 armor. Besides that, they're basically skeleton warriors with rank 9 stats, and they get poison. So great as support. You throw them in. They're cheaper than Graveguard, so you can throw them in with your Graveguard to provide poison support, to still sort of be tanky, provide additional utility. If you need to flesh out your front line a little bit while staying on a budget, these guys are a good way to go. They're budget Graveguard, and that's all there's to say. But I think that is enough to put them at B tier. The Feasters in the Dusk are, in my mind, B, leaning towards A tier, actually. Basically, everything that the Crypt Ghouls have about them that sucks, these guys actually overcome most of it. Much better combat stats because they're rank 9. Much better speed. They're at 42 versus, I believe it's 35 on generic Crypt Ghouls. These guys have Stalk. These guys have Vanguard, which means that you're less likely to get shot up. And you can really pick those engagements that you want. Against Dwarves, for example, you can get these. There's actually, most matchup, these guys are strong because you can get them in on a unit like Dwarves. They get in on Slayers, they get in on Rangers, and they're doing work. These guys are not pushovers. They're a very strong unit, in my opinion. For me, with how much I use these guys, they'd probably be closer to an A tier. But I will give them a B tier here. I think they are still a bit niche just because it's a Vanguard, and it is a squishy unit, despite all those benefits of Stalk and Vanguard. But I think B is a very solid place for these guys. Sternsmen, easy A tier. You're not always going to bring Sternsmen when you bring Graveguard. You're not always going to bring Graveguard when you bring Sternsmen. The units Stearnsmen, because of how expensive they are a bit niche, despite their stellar performance. You will sometimes there's actually plenty of builds where you won't bring any Graveguard and you'll just bring like 1 unit of Stearnsmen. But at the same time, if you want just a budget wide front line, you might just bring like 3 Graveguard or something and not bother with Stearnsmen, because paying that extra 350 gold premium is a lot. That's an entire extra unit of like skeletons or skeleton spears or something like that you could put on the field, and you can't because you took Stearnsmen instead of normal Graveguard. And depending on situation, it's not worth the investment. So I think they're an A tier. Definitely both them and Graveguard. Even the spears leaning towards S, but very potent unit. Which does get us on to the Cavalry. So Cavalry, Black Knights, easy A in my opinion. Cheap heavy cav with decent armor, decent sustained combat stats, high weapon strength, decent speed, 78 I believe off the top of my head. Yeah, great for backline harass, great for disruption. One of the reasons Direwolves are not going to make it very high up on this list is because these guys are so cheap and efficient for what they do. Really can be an absolute menace on your opponent's backlines, and yeah, make an easy A tier. And if you need some disruption or need some support in a cav fight, they can be an okay choice to support your Black Knight or Blood Knight, sorry. Definitely not a unit you're going to bring in every build, but I think against a lot of factions or against factions that tend to bring lots of shooting, these guys are just a must-have as a backline disrupt. So definitely an A, somewhere between A and B tier, really. Now, Black Knights with Lance and Barding are the redheaded stepchild of the Vampire Count Cav roster. Actually, that's not true. Hex rates are probably in there with them too, but in my opinion, a C tier. They're not a terrible unit for their cost at 1050 gold, but they're sandwiched between 2 stellar cavalry options. Black Knights on one end, and then Blood Knights on the other. Most players, they're just looking for backline harass and a cheap cav, heavy cav, they're going to bring Black Knights. If they're looking to stomp large and need a hard carry unit, which honestly Blood Knights often are, they are going to take Blood Knights. Black Knights end up with a C tier. There are some matchups where they can still be strong, but they take a lot of micro. They're very unforgiving due to their terrible sustained combat stats. And I think C is probably generous. They're probably leaning somewhere between C and D tier, unfortunately. I think in hindsight, given the way I've ranked some of these units down here, yeah, that's probably fair. These guys are hovering somewhere between C and D tier. Which just brings us on to Hex Wraiths, another unit that is in my book going to get a C tier. They are definitely better than Cairn Wraiths. Cairn Wraiths are just too slow and too flimsy compared to Hex Wraiths. Hex Wraiths can actually go toe-to-toe with some elite anti-large cap. I believe they actually almost beat Demigryph Knights with halberds in a straight-up fight, which is insane for a unit that's essentially a light cavalry. The problem is that, once again, magic damage tears them a new one. That, and for some inexplicable reason, they do fire damage, which means that they're really bad against, for example, high elves, because they can't hurt dragon princes. And that's actually a matchup where these guys would probably be kind of useful if they just did magic damage like Cairn Wraiths, because you could definitely pick your engagements with them, not get run over by dragon princes supported by Alariel, but then cycle charge the enemy box. Or you could, for example, use Blood Knights to win against the dragon princes, and then use Hex Wraiths to cycle charge down Phoenix Guard. But because of the fire damage, they're just such a liability in that matchup. But I think C tier is fair. Against some factions, they can just run ham. 94 speed, ethereal, they can be disgusting. Against a faction like Beastmen, who don't have too much to counter you, they can do insane amounts of work. I'm sure you guys have seen, some of you guys have seen the recent replay I did with Fallers in the Gash, where I use these guys. And that's actually a roster that's not well supported, kitted to supporting these guys. So I think these guys, C tier, probably fair. Which does get us on to the last, but certainly not least, heavy cav for the Vampire Counts, and that is Blood Knights. And these guys get an S tier. Stellar unit. Basically, the only matchup where they might not be great is maybe Vampire Coast, and then maybe, well, probably Dwarves. But besides Dwarves, you can make these guys work in just about every match. Well, I guess you can make them work in any matchup, but Dwarves are the only one where I think they're an outright terrible choice. And I think they're not a great choice against Coast. But besides that, a very, very strong option. Very mobile cav, hits like a truck, beats most large in the game in a straight up fight. Crush infantry with cycle charging, can kill monsters in sustained combat if properly supported. Just a stellar unit, and I really can't recommend these guys enough. Definitely a great option. They are your best anti-large option as vampire counts. Terrorgeists are not bad, don't get me wrong, but in a versatility situation, these guys are just better, in my opinion. There's more matchups where these guys are an option than matchups where the Terrorgeists are an option. Now, that does bring us to Regiments of Renown. Varix Reavers, B tier in my opinion. They overcome some of the issues with Black Knights by having better combat stats, which makes them less of a liability if they get forgotten about. They also have regen, so you don't necessarily have to invest massive amounts of Winds of Magic to keep these guys top in at least passable shape, which makes them a B tier. They can kind of play a solo game where they just run around in the enemy backline, disrupt, and recover at least some of their HP. Where Black Knights are too expensive to the point that you want to support to heal them, but at the same time that's taking away from more elite units. With the Varix Reavers, because they self-heal, they're just sort of in a decent spot. Definitely can run amok in the backline. Not a unit you're going to take in every match, but a nice supplement and a nice backline harasser. Their brethren, the Chillgeist, the other Regiment around Cav, are also B tier in my book. Better than normal Hextrace by far. They've got the Chilling Aura, which is amazing for snaring light cav, makes them synergize super well with the Dire Pack if I could find them. And right over there, the Dire Pack synergizes stupidly well with these guys for hunting light cav. They obviously suffer the similar problems of getting bursted down by magic to hex rates, but they don't want to do fire damage, which is a bit of a win. Better combat stats because they're in rank 9. Better leadership so they don't crumble as easily. Definitely a B tier for me. And with that, we are on to, well, we've got two options. It's either War Machines or Monsters. And because some of the War Machines are boring as all heck, we are going to go with the War Machines. So, for the first and foremost, first option here, we are going to go with a normal Corpse Cart. This unit is, in my opinion, probably a C tier. Slow, similar issues to zombies. It's a decent support option because it does provide Vigor Mortis for only 250 gold, plus 5 melee attack, plus 5 melee defense. Very strong. But it's slow. 223 speed means it's not going to be supporting any cav engagements. It's only supporting your infantry line, and there's not too many infantry line-based builds for vampire accounts, so kind of meh. And it's very easy to snipe out if your opponent so chooses, which, granted, sniping it out is a bit of a waste in some cases, but still, it can greatly hurt you. Now, the Balefire Corpse Cart is F tier. It's basically a normal Corpse Cart that, if it gets into an engagement, can greatly reduce your enemy's Winds of Magic regen, depending on how many units are close to it. The problem is, it's slow, so getting into that position is very difficult to begin with. Second of all, in multiplayer, your opponent will probably get all 30 Winds of Magic, and maybe then some, before your line's ever really beat. This means that the Balefire Corpse Cart is not really hurting your opponent's Winds of Magic generation until they've almost used up or generated most of their Winds of Magic. That hurts it a lot. You get 60 Winds of Magic, so unless you've got some perk like Arcane Conduit or Power Stone or whatever, the Greater Arcane Conduit, something along those lines. So most of the time, your opponent will just snipe you out. Or just ignore you. They'll get their 30 basic Winds of Magic out, and then chances are they'll probably use some of it before lines ever meet, and regenerate it back before the Corpse Cart gets there. So the odds of this unit making a serious impact are basically non-existent, and it costs more than normal Corpse Cart, so yeah, why bother? Now the Lodestone, same thing as normal Corpse Cart. It's double the price, double the fun. It provides a healing aura in AoE, which does stack with other healing auras. Except I believe it is redundant with the Mortis engine, so I believe both have the same healing effect, though I could be wrong. Either way, it does stack with other healing auras, so it can provide your line with some insane survivability. Once again, though, slow definitely hinders your approach, much like the Corpse Cart, much like zombies, and that is why it's going to get a C tier. But that regen aura plus Vigor Mortis is very strong. Black Coach used to be a bit of a meme, but now probably a B, to be honest. It's not a bad unit. If it gets all of its abilities off, its passives off, it is an insane unit. It can do lots of damage. It has damage mitigation. I believe it's 44% damage mitigation. It gets Strider, so it's incredibly difficult to stop. Just a stellar unit in that long game, and it's a cheap source of terror. The only cheaper options for terror are the Cairn Wraith as well as the Banshee. Off the top of my head, I don't want to be made a liar here, but I believe those are the only two options for cheaper terror, at least unit terror. So definitely a solid option there. Can run over infantry is kind of an important choice in some of the worst matchups vampire accounts have, such as high elves, and can definitely do you proud. Not the most amazing unit for sure, but has its niche, has its place, and certainly can make an impact. Now the Mortis Engine, A tier, and probably would be an S tier if it wasn't for its big brother, the Claw of Nagash. These two units can literally decide certain matchups. Chaos especially, Beastmen, they can decide. It's not a great unit in every matchup because against factions that can bring a lot of shooting, these units tend to die very easily. But, big but, in matchups where you're faced with an enemy blob of infantry, more grindy close quarters gameplay, the Mortis Engine can be the game changer. It can be the game winning unit, and the Claw of Nagash especially is just a beast because some of the weaknesses that the normal Mortis Engine has, most notably weakness to magic spell, whether Spirit Leech, Fireball, that sort of thing, are somewhat negated by the Claw of Nagash. It gets 25% magic resist. It also gets a 36% speed reducing aura, which helps prevent it from getting sniped by big melee monsters, and that negates most of its counters except shooting. Even against some shooting factions, it's not a terrible choice, because if you can shut down their shooting, which is not always hard for vampire accounts with zombie summons and light monsters, it can melt face, and it's just a very powerful tool, despite the nerfs it has received over the years. Now going on to monsters, first and foremost, bats, B tier. So the big problem for these guys is that they used to be almost a staple, and especially because they were especially a staple for vampire account flyer builds. But with the new limits on flyers, these guys got hamstrung a lot, and it's much more difficult, I think, to justify bringing bats because flyer builds are just less common. With only 5 flying units that you can bring, you might not even bother as vampire accounts, and so bats are less common now. Still a good disrupt tool, still quick, can still harass and disrupt opponents, but and still a very valuable choice. But they do disintegrate very easily. They've got very low HP, very low leadership, and yeah, one of the main builds that they used to support is much more restricted nowadays. Direwolves, I really like this unit, but they're not really that competitive for the price. 500 gold, they're probably a good 25 to 50 gold overpriced, so C tier for me. They disrupt backlines, they can harry fast skirmishers, but ultimately, just at 500 gold, they're a very pricey backline harasser. Can be somewhat difficult to justify, and oftentimes bats will just do the same job better. Even if you're not going for a flyer build, the bats are often just a better choice. Which then does bring us on to Crypt Horrors. This unit, it's gotten some buffs recently. It used to be sort of a top dog for the vampire accounts. Then it got nerfed and into garbage tier, and it's sort of slowly clawed its way back, I think, but a little bit. But I still think it isn't great. I struggle to choose between D and C tier. I don't think it really belongs in C tier because it's just not as good as some of these others. So, Crypt Ghouls are honestly better. They're more versatile. Something like Hex Rates is ultimately better. Zombies are definitely better. I would rate this guy as D, unfortunately. The big problem for them is they're just so very flimsy. They die to everything, and their combat sets are not amazing, so they don't necessarily dish out the hurt that you would like them to. They're just better. They're very limited in role. If your opponent is trying to plow through you with big monster plays, you generally will want to stop them with something like a Vargulf, or not Vargulf, Terrorgeist or Blood Knights, units like that. They used to be a bit of a desperation choice against Tomb Kings, but that's fallen off nowadays because Tomb Kings got nerfed a bunch, especially Arkan, who made those builds so abusive. So I think D tier is probably where these guys belong. Vargeists, probably a C. I've actually used these guys quite a bit recently, which is why I'm hesitant to put them there. They're fun to use, but and they're especially great in campaign, but less so in multiplayer. Though in multiplayer, I do enjoy them. But once again, those nerfs to Vampire Flyer builds mean that, are you going to go for a Flyer build? Oftentimes, probably not, because it's just hard to cram all the units in. You can't get a Flying Lord, 2 Terrorgeists, and then say a Vargeist or 2 and 2 Bats or something to support them. You can't. So you got to make sacrifices somewhere. Chances are you're just not going to bother with the Vargeists. I think they got the shortest end of the stick here, because you'll generally take big monsters and Bats before you take big monsters and Vargeists, or Vargeists and Bats or something like that. And so unfortunately the Vargeists get a C tier here. And Devil Schwarzhofen are in much, well, we'll get to them in a sec, but they're in much the same boat. Honestly, well, I'll do them. Normally I do regiments around last, but they're honestly in the same boat here. They do get Terror and Vanguard, but they're also more expensive. And both units are just difficult to justify, I think, most of the time, even though they're not terrible units by any stretch of the imagination. They're just very flimsy, can't help you contest the skies all that well, and limits them. Vargulf, still an A tier in my opinion. Stupid fast, provides AP, great in a death ball supporting Blood Knights. It has solid melee stats. Its big downside, it's non-existent armor and lower HP for a single entity, but with mobility and combat stats, you can compensate for that quite a bit. So definitely an A tier. A death ball of Vargulfs remains a terror on the battlefield, and even if you don't spam Vargulfs, bring one alongside, say, Blood Knights is stupidly strong. You get those big AP swings from the Vargulf, while the Blood Knights just tie your opponent down and prevent them from surrounding the Vargulf. Just an amazing synergy there. Really strong unit. Terrorgeist is actually going to be a B tier, and back in the day, this unit would probably be an S alongside the Blood Knights. But once again, flyer builds have just been hamstrung a lot for Vampire accounts because of those flyer limits, and I'm not going to rehash that a whole bunch again, but that limits Terrorgeist. Terrorgeist don't have the versatility against infantry that Blood Knights do. They have breath attacks, which kind of compensates, but the Terrorgeist breath attack is kind of crap, so it's much more oriented at single targets, so they get a B tier for me. And still a strong unit. They can still do quite a lot of hurt to single entities or cavalry if well supported, but I think in most matchups you're rather going to bring Blood Knights over Terrorgeist nowadays. Finally, the Dire Pack. I actually give these guys an A tier. I think they're very good. Anti-large hounds, just stellar. I think I bring these guys with many of my builds. They're great to support your Blood Knights. They are great to support Hex Wraiths, or specifically Chillgeists. They are great by themselves. You can throw them in against cheaper, lightly armored monsters. Like, for example, Rat Ogres. You could actually mince them with these guys. You can really mince a lot of lower armor monstrosities with the Dire Pack. They will do good against characters on eagles. They will do well against most dragons, to be honest. They will do well against griffins for most part. They will do well again. Yeah, they just do well against most large. And plus, because a lot of the against large targets, like for example Pegasus Knights, if they come to ground, they have a bonus versus large. They're not really oriented at fighting the Dire Pack, and so the Dire Pack can often crump them. They can often tear them limb from limb, and maybe not win, but they'll definitely be They'll definitely be very cost effective. And against Beastmen, granted that's a very skewed matchup in the Vampire Count's favor to begin with, but against Beastmen, these guys are just disgusting sometimes. And yeah, easy A tier for them. So that is my list for the Vampire Counts. There, my tier list. I will be continuing this series now. Hopefully, going to be trying to stay a bit consistent with the releases. I do have more historical videos on the way. I know I've been laying off those, just haven't really had the time to put them together. I know many of you guys enjoy those, so those will be coming along as well. More community casts, more personal casts, all sorts of stuff coming along. Hopefully you guys do enjoy. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. As usual, do not hesitate to put your own comments, critiques, or thoughts down below. Believe it or not, I do read all of them, and I also often take inspiration from them. And then I go out and I test a lot of the units, or give them a fair shake. If you guys give me great ideas or some ideas on how to use them properly, I actually find it fun to try them out and give them a fair shot. I really do appreciate the feedback. So certainly don't hesitate to put your thoughts down below. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.